It is November in 1097. Soldiers, knights, and noblemen have answered the call of Pope Urban II to retake the Holy Land from Islamic forces. Now, the Christian army, mostly from France, are laying siege to Antioch, a strategic location on the route to Palestine. From here, they could control movement through the area and establish a hub for reinforcements and supplies. It has been a long, difficult, and dangerous campaign, with many casualties on both sides. The massive city of Antioch is heavily fortified, well defended, and well supplied. A long and difficult winter lies ahead for the attackers, and their supplies are running low. Efforts to scavenge the local area have not been successful, and although some of the local Christians bring them food, it is not enough. But word has just arrived on foot that ships were seen arriving at the nearby port of St. Simeon. 13 ships from Genoa have arrived, loaded with reinforcements and supplies. The ships are unloaded, and the massive column begins the 9-mile trek to Antioch. But they are attacked by the Seljuk Turks, who are on foot and on horseback, and suffer heavy casualties. Bohemund of Taranto orders a counterfort to be built along the northeast walls of Antioch to defend his Crusader troops against the deadly projectiles coming from inside the city. The siege would go on for many months, but in the end, the Christian forces would prevail and take the city of Antioch, at least temporarily. The ships of the Crusades, today, on Shipwrecks and Sea Dogs. Hello and welcome to Shipwrecks and Sea Dogs. I am your host, Rich Napolitano. I am very pleased to be joined today by Dr. Nicholas Morton. He is an associate professor with the School of Arts and Humanities at Nottingham Trent University and an expert on the history of the Crusades. Nick, thank you so much for joining me today.
It's a pleasure to be on the show. Thank you, Rich.
Now, I've asked you to join me to talk about the ships of the Crusades era and their role during this time period. But before we get to that, let's start with a bit about your background and your work. When did you first get your passion for history?
I studied history at university, going back a long way now, and I became fascinated in the history of the Crusades and the medieval Middle East. And since then, I've published or edited 10 books on the subject. And they're not on ships, they're on all sorts of subjects, on the Knights Templar and crusading warfare and the Mongols and people like that. So they're fairly wide-ranging. The most recent, if you're interested, is called The Mongol Storm, which is a history of the 13th century Middle East and the Mongol invasions into the area. But in and amongst that research on various subjects, I kept going back to the question, which is that when the first Crusaders advanced into the Middle East and set up a series of territories that became known as the Crusader states, how did they support those territories, given that they are over hundreds of miles from the nearest Italian port? They have to be resupplied by sea, and we're talking about 11th, 12th century technology. How did they do it? And so I always had an interest in Crusader ships, in how that worked, because that's the umbilical cord that makes the Crusader states and the Crusaders' control over Jerusalem work for almost a century. And the Crusader states themselves last for 2 centuries. But it all depends on ships.
You mentioned the books you have published, including your most recent book. Where can listeners find your work?
Sure. So it's called The Mongol Storm, Making and Breaking Empires in the Medieval Near East. The easiest way of doing it is just to go onto Amazon and type in my name in the title. So Nicholas Morton, Mongol Storm would find it. Alternatively, you can buy it through the publisher's website, which is Basic Books. And it's available as hard copy, paperback, or as audio, or as ebook, depending on whatever you prefer.
Thank you. I'm most certainly going to be reading The Mongol Storm. It's a bit of a blind spot in my knowledge of history, and I definitely want to learn more about it. So let's set the stage for what was going on in this part of the world at this time, more specifically the Middle East.
There's a lot going on. The Mongols are invading the Middle East. The Crusades are failing. The Ottoman and Mamluk empires in the Middle East are rising. There's gunpowder arriving on the scene for the first time. There's the maritime compass. The world is becoming a much bigger place as civilizations send out emissaries all over the place. And we see that within the beginnings of what will ultimately be the European expansion, which in time will lead to the formation of European empires. So there's a lot taking place, including quite a lot of things you don't necessarily sort of automatically associate with the Mongols in the Middle East in the 13th century, and that's what it's all about, really.
What were the motivations for the conflicts surrounding the Crusades, both for the Christian forces and also the Turks and Mongols?
Sure. So it's the 11th century, and in the 11th century, Western Europe's really something of a backwater compared to other areas in Eurasia. In China's the really big civilization that's not involved in the events we're talking about. And in the Middle East, there is a massive invasion going on. And that invasion goes back to a long-standing fault line in Eurasian history. And that's the one thing everyone's afraid of, which we've forgotten to be afraid of now because it hasn't happened for hundreds of years. And that is nomadic invasion. So you may have heard of the Huns and the invasion of the Roman Empire, and then a few centuries later it's the Avars, and a few centuries later it's the Pechenegs, and in the 11th century it's the Seljuk Turks. And the Seljuk Turks invade the Middle East and conquer large areas of it, overthrowing much of the Muslim world in that area, and they slowly begin to convert to Islam themselves, and that brings about a great deal of upheaval. And emissaries go back reporting attacks on pilgrims trying to reach Jerusalem. And then some parts of the Seljuk Turkish invasions reach the Byzantine Empire, which is very simply all that's left of the Eastern Roman Empire. And a great deal of territory is taken from the Eastern Roman Empire in the 11th century. And again, emissaries go back to Western Europe. So there are people asking for help from the region, and they arrive at the papacy. And the Pope has all sorts of other problems of his own. He's aware that there is an anti-pope threatening his position and raised by the German emperor. That's a problem. He's also aware that in southern France, he simply can't stem the infighting taking place between knightly families and the Pope Urban II. He's from southern France. He knows this is a problem. He can't solve it. Now, exactly what part of that mix drives him to launch a crusade, or perhaps all of it, we don't entirely know, because he doesn't really say, this is what I'm really after. Somewhere in and amongst those factors, the Pope launches a crusade, which of course has the objective of seizing Jerusalem, in doing so protecting the pilgrim routes, defending the Byzantine Empire, giving the anti-pope a victory on his part to worry about, which strengthens his position, and sending the southern French nobility and knights off to do something else other than killing each other. So in some ways, it's a golden bullet. The problem with it being a golden bullet is we're not sure which of those factors is really uppermost in his mind. But this is the background to it. And so that happens in 1095. The army set out in 1097. And by 1099, the first Crusaders besiege and very brutally sack Jerusalem, which is simply the last in a series of cities they conquer in the Middle East, which then form the basis for 4 European territories, which in their longest example survived for 200 years, or almost 200 years, which are the Kingdom of Jerusalem in the south, then to the north of that, the County of Tripoli, the Principality of Antioch, and the County of Edessa. And so that's the starting point of the Crusades, but it's also the starting point of a maritime problem, which is, okay, so hundreds of miles from the nearest friendly territory, you've created a series of states. How are you going to support that? How are you going to get out the Crusaders, the settlers, the mercenaries, the merchants, the people and families who will make that work? And it's so much worse than it would be for a modern commander or facing a similar thing, because the technology isn't particularly developed. ships aren't that strong. They can't survive the winter storms in the Mediterranean between October and April. So that's just out of bounds in sailing terms. And the Eastern Mediterranean already has a major military fleet, which is that of the Fatimid Empire in Egypt. And so any ships trying to reach the Crusader states are going to face a fleet facing them should they try and do so. So it's a very difficult predicament for the early settlers of the Crusader states.
Now, when we think of the Crusades, or at least when I think of the Crusades, ships never really come to mind, and probably don't for most other people. But we think of these long and dusty columns of knights and soldiers with all the other personnel marching these long distance overland and on their way through Constantinople and down into the Holy Land.
So, yes, you're absolutely right. You think of the Crusades, you think of, as you say, armies marching over long distances over land. But to get to the Holy Land, you've got to cross Anatolia, or modern day Turkey, which involves crossing the central Anatolian plateau, which is dry, it's fairly flat, and you are exposed at many points in the journey to situations where you can be picked apart by Turkish light cavalry. Now, there are periods in the history of the Crusades where it's called the Anatolian Seljuk Sultanate actually forms an alliance with the Crusader states, and people can travel overland during those periods. But there is also a reason why the Anatolian plateau is called the graveyard of armies, because although the first crusade crossed it, no other army really crossed it intact. One did, but fell apart immediately afterwards. Really, to get armies, troops, settlers, and particularly bulk supplies, resources, tools, equipment out, it's going to have to go by ship. And so, yes, there is an overland option, but really, it becomes a maritime problem very, very quickly.
So we have these massive armies in the Middle East and the problem of resupplying them by sea. So where would these ships have come from?
A lot of these ships come from the big Italian cities, places like Pisa, Venice, and Genoa, which of course become famous later on. They're just at the start of their rise to power at this point, and their involvement in the Crusades will bring about a meteoric rise in their fortunes. They support the armies of the First Crusade, supply maritime logistics for a time, but they realize very quickly that however much they have a strong religious motive to take part in these ventures, they realize also they're sitting on a gold mine, because the big ports of the Eastern Mediterranean coastline, places like Acre, Tyre, Latakia, Tripoli, these are all ports that are the western extension of the Silk Roads. And so if you can maintain a presence in those ports, then suddenly you have trade routes and commercial opportunities available to you, which are extraordinarily lucrative. And so part of the reason the Crusader states grow initially is because the Italian cities send fleets to help conquer the coastal ports, in part for pious reasons, but in part also because they want to be able to set up a group of merchants there, and then to begin a regular trade with the Middle East, and therefore silks, spices, porcelain, other commodities that will then command an enormous price in Western Christendom. So those Italian cities are major powers involved in this traffic, the commerce between the Crusader states and Western Christendom. Other southern Italian ports play a major role as well, places like Brindisi, Bari, Barletta in the southern sort of the heel of Italy, and also Messina in Sicily, later on Barcelona and Marseille in southern France and northern Spain. Nearly all the shipping comes via the Mediterranean. A little bit comes from sort of the North Sea region via Gibraltar. There is, for example, in 1110, a Norwegian crusade led by King Sigurd of Norway, who leads a fleet of longships from all the way from Norway through into the Mediterranean and then on to the Crusader states. So there are some ships that come via other routes. There are some English and northern German fleets that do that too, but the bulk of the shipping is southern Italian or northern Italian, with some also from southern France and Sicily as well.
Now, regarding the ships that would be supplying the Crusade states, what style of ships would these have been during this time?
Okay, so there are various types. Let's start with the most important. Most important are the bulk transports. These are the ships that just carry huge amounts of stuff and people. And obviously, they are the most important because they are what's bringing out the personnel and materials necessary for the Crusader states to work. And they start off sort of medium sized, perhaps. So perhaps able to carry sort of 100, 200, 300 people max, and not for very long distances. And what they would do to get out to the Crusader states is they would island hop. So if you started, say, in Venice, you'd island hop down either the Italian or Croatian coast down to Italy, and then from Aegean Island to Aegean Island, places like Rhodes or Crete and Cyprus, and then using these as stopping points to re-water and re-provision to then get to the Crusader states. But the main point is Crusader ships get a lot bigger. And so within about 50 or 60 years, some of the Crusader ships or ships carrying Crusaders, there's nothing special about a Crusader ship. It's just a ship that happens to be carrying these people. They get to a size where they can carry up to 1,500 people. The largest number I've ever heard anyone cite is 2,000. Now, I think the 2,000 is an overestimate, but it's not just fantasy sources or sources where people are using their imagination. We've got legal contracts say a ship has a contracted number of people to go. The contract I was looking at recently had 1,100 people specified. We have Western European sources saying 1,000, 1,500. We have Islamic sources also reporting Crusader ships could get this big. So it needs to be taken seriously that these kinds of numbers could be carried, and some of them in a fair degree of comfort. And this in some ways upends much of what is commonly known about medieval ships, because normally there's a little bit like that evolution of the human species, where initially they're stooped and carrying tools, and then they get a bit more upright and as they evolve. It's thought that ships started really small and then grew over time. Actually, Crusader ships were absolutely huge, and in many cases, maritime historians don't recognise them as getting that big until sort of the 16th or 17th century. But no, in the 12th, they could still be that big, and it's something that it needs to be fitted in better into the maritime history of this period. But that's the big. They're called naves, which literally translates as ships, and they're powered by sail. They're also fairly defensible because they're so huge. They're a little bit like a sort of old-fashioned drawing of Noah's Ark, in a sense. They're huge, they're fairly round, they're very high out of the water. So take Noah's Ark, stick a couple of masts on it, give them square sails, with a black cross on the sails, and you've got a Crusader transport vessel, but make it big. That's the big one. The other one that's really important is the classic warship of this era, and they're galleys. Now, galleys are totally different. They're smaller, they're a great deal faster, they're powered by both a lateen-rigged sail and oars. So lateen-rigged would be sort of fore and aft, rising diagonally above the deck. They're capable of immense turns of speed, even up to sort of 7 to 10 knots, which is remarkable for the medieval period. I realize it's not today, but at the time it was. The era of the maritime ram is over. So sort of when we think about galleys, we think of Roman and Greek galleys all busy ramming each other. Rams died out in about the 6th century because the hull construction techniques got too robust for them to be really that effective. They were replaced later on with a spur, which is at deck height, that you then, when you turn the ship across the deck, that will then sweep the deck. That's another way of doing it. But for this period, really, it's crossbows. Lines of crossbowmen, and particularly nasty weapon is powdered lime. So get your ship upwind of your opponent and then release bags of lime or powdered lime into the air. It'll drift down in the wind, get in your opponent's eyes and send them blind. So no weapons are nice, but that's a particularly sort of nasty way of doing it. But these are the kinds of weapons we're talking about. Another weapon deployed by Byzantine fleets so that's Eastern Roman fleets essentially, is Greek fire, which is basically a combination of chemicals that can be ignited, channeled down a tube, and then propelled as a flamethrower onto an opposing ship. And of course, ships being essentially dry wood for the most part will burn very nicely. So that's another weapon that could be used. But galleys, yes. Big problem with galleys is they're fairly vulnerable. Even a moderate chop, so maybe even a chop or swell of about 3 to 5 feet, would give a galley captain serious pause for thought, because they're just not built for it. They're not that high off the water. They've been built for speed and aggression, not for seaworthiness. So you've got to be careful with galleys where you take them out, in what conditions you take them out. And also, all those thirsty rowers need several litres a day in hot weather, and it's all hot weather in this period pretty much. So you can't take a galley away from the coastline for too long, because the rowers will begin to expire fairly quickly, and they need to be properly hydrated. We're talking about, normally they're biremes in this period, and that's not 2 banks of oars on each side. That's biremes interpreted rather differently. So it would be 1 bank of oars with 2 rowers per oar. These are the 2 main types of ships, but the most common type of ship, ironically, is neither of these great bulk carriers or warships. The most common type of ship in the Crusader states is small coastal vessels, who conduct much of the trade. They island hop, they carry small numbers of passengers, and for every big galley or big sailing ship, there's thousands of these coastal vessels as well.
You were talking about the armaments on board, having the galleys being very fast and aggressive to offer protection. What sort of engagements would have taken place on the water between these opposing forces?
Okay, so after the initial foundation of the Crusader states, the Pisan, the Genoese, the Venetian fleets very, very quickly sweep the Eastern Mediterranean of all rival powers. And the main rival power is Fatimid Egypt, which is a Shia Muslim caliphate. And so in a series of engagements, the Italian fleets defeat the Fatimid navy over and over again until basically they have maritime dominance. We don't hear much about these engagements, but they seem for the most part to have been the basic tactics used in this era. Sometimes they strap the galleys together and make a massive sort of platform out of them, and a sort of defensible castle from joined together galleys. In other cases, it's simply about trying to wrong foot your opponent by acquiring a weather gauge, moving down on them quickly and picking them off by attacking the flank of an enemy fleet, or waiting for them to be dispersed by a storm and then attacking them, that kind of thing. After the Fatimid navy's been defeated, then most of the naval battles are the Italian navies fighting between themselves, which they do over and over again for the next X number of 100 years. I mean, they don't stop doing it, really. And in some ways, that helps them to refine their techniques, but of course it's also enormously destructive at the same time too. But for the most part, yes, it's crossbows and boarding actions that seem to have been the main activity. The most challenging of those kinds of encounter were when you try to tackle a big transport vessel with galleys, because it's actually quite hard to get up onto the big ship's deck because it's so high above the water. And so when Richard I of England during the Third Crusade tried to tackle one of Saladin's big vessels of this kind, he really did struggle. He did eventually take it, but he really, really struggled to get access to the deck because it was so high from the water.
So these ships are bringing all these people and all these supplies to the Crusade states to help support their efforts. What would they be importing back to Italy?
They bring people out and they bring goods and other things out, but what they're bringing back for the most part is trade goods. And that's partly via the trade routes that pass through the Crusader states. And that, as I mentioned, that could be silk or porcelain from China or things like that. It could also be goods brought via the Indian Ocean from Southeast Asia, via the Persian Gulf, through places like Baghdad, Mosul, Aleppo, and then onto the Mediterranean coast. Those things could be spices, and spices is a collective term for things like nutmeg and pepper and cumin. And these spices are consumed in enormous quantities in medieval Europe to such an extent that some historians have speculated that actually the aristocratic diet in much of medieval Europe may have actually had a closer resemblance in terms of, sort of the ingredients that go into it to an Indian diet than indeed to that of their own peasantry, because it's the status thing. I'm not quite sure what the modern day thing would be. It's a bit like caviar, I suppose. But if you go to a dinner party and someone produces all these spices, not only is it about the flavor, but it's about the wow factor. It's saying, I can provide this as for my guests, and that makes me look important and prestigious. So that there's goods carried over long distances, but increasingly there's also a large local trade, because the Crusader states themselves, they quickly start to build up their industrial heft. And what they specialize in is glassware, ceramics, and the really, really big one, which is booming everywhere in the East Mediterranean, is sugar. Can't grow sugar everywhere. You need lots and lots of fresh water, and you need lots and lots of sun. And the coastal regions of the Eastern Mediterranean have that because they have an area of highland. The mountains of Lebanon would be a good example of this, only about 10 to 20 miles inland. So in the heat of the day, the heat rises over the land, bringing in a sea breeze carrying moisture. That moisture is forced above the mountains, where it condenses, falls as rain, and then runs down back into the Mediterranean by way of rivers. So you have heat and water in that area, and that's exactly where the Crusader states are. And so they can mass produce sugar, and that, of course, commands a very pretty price in many places across the Mediterranean. And so sugar becomes an enormously important cash crop for the Crusader states, and both the Knights Templar and the Knights Hospitaller, they've got big ships too. They become leading industrialists in sugar production. Industrialist is a modern day word, but they are very much building up sugar production precisely because it commands such a price, and that money can then be used to build their enormous Crusader castles or the other things they're doing to try and sort of fortify the frontiers of the Crusader states.
Was this a lucrative venture for the Crusaders, or was that not really a motivation for the participants?
There could be. If you're a merchant, yes, there is the opportunity to get rich, and some do. Templars and Hospitallers became fabulously wealthy, but they're ploughing all that wealth back into troops and castles, so it's not wealth for wealth's sake per se, but there are some who do get very rich. Having said that, most Crusaders don't. The cost of going on crusade for your average knight is about 4 to 5 times a knight's annual income, which in modern day terms, if you sort of do a very, very crude comparison to what purchasing power might be for your average knight nowadays, you're probably talking about a round trip cost of over £1 million, or maybe £1 million or $1 million in modern day money. And very few knights come back richer, and they don't have the facility to carry much with them, because often just paying their own fare to get out there is expensive enough. If they want money, there are wars closer to hand that will generate a bigger income. And added to that, if a knight were to join one of the big crusading campaigns, the chances of coming home again are very, very low. So, for example, the survival rate of the First Crusade has been set at about 3 to 1 against. So 4 people go, 1 person comes back, which for someone balancing economic interests, those are not good odds. So merchants did get wealthy, but your average Crusader, it's going to have to be something stronger than economics driving them, because Crusaders rarely return back richer unless they've actually commissioned a merchant vessel and they're really going as a merchant / Crusader in the way that many Italian merchants did.
And when we talk about the Crusades, we're not talking about a 5 to 10 year engagement. This was a period that lasted a couple hundred of years. at least in its primary period. What kind of technological advances occurred over this time?
Yeah, so this for me at least is something I find fascinating, which is the question of how did the history of the Crusades, the history of the Middle East in this era, how did that change technology, technological approaches, innovation? And a theory I keep coming back to is that irrespective of what you think of the Crusades, they compelled their organizers, whether those organizers were kings or military commanders or anyone else, to act profoundly out of character. It is not normal for a general in, say, Germany or France to march an army over thousands of miles to try and take and hold a city hundreds of miles from the nearest friendly outpost. That involves challenges that the commander will not have encountered before. And so there is no choice but for that commander to innovate. What type of wagons do you use? Four-wheeled wagons? They're too heavy. The roads won't bear them. Two-wheeled wagons? They might work, but again, it's a question of balancing up the needs of the animal, the needs of the quality of the roads, or do you use baggage animals? But the problem with baggage animals is that they don't carry very much, and so you have thousands of them, and they have to be fed too. All these sorts of considerations come into play. Then when you get to the Crusader states, then there's the question of, well, okay, the people on the other side of the battlefield, for the most part, are Turkish light cavalry, but no one in Western Christendom has encountered them before. So how do you defeat them? Or you could spin it round and say, well, okay, let's say you're a Seljuk Turkish commander. You're facing Crusader knights. You never met them before. How do you deal with them? The whole business of the Crusades, whether in warfare or economics or logistics or castle building and architecture, it forces people to do things differently. And that is as true for a Crusade commander as it would be for the Fatimid vizier or a Seljuk Turkish emir or for any of the other peoples in the Middle East. They're all having to do things differently. And there's other challenges that are coming into play as well, which is that, as I mentioned already directly before the Crusades, the greater part of the Middle East has just been invaded anyway by a nomadic people. So all sorts of new challenges are being created for which there are not solutions. And my feeling, at least, is when you create that sort of situation where everything's up in the air and really victory is going to go to the person who adapts first, then you've got a very fertile seedbed for all sorts of forms of innovation by multiple cultures. And sorry to raise my book again, but then the Mongols invade in the 13th century, which is only 100 years after the First Crusade. Crusaders are still there, and you get a whole new set of innovations. It's not just new ideas, but the Seljuk Turks and the Mongols are coming from Central Asia. There's merchants from Southeast Asia. There's Crusaders from Western Europe. There's Muslim societies already in the Middle East. There's Byzantium in Greece and the Aegean. They've all got existing technologies, and suddenly all these various different civilizations are all being forced together or put together or moving together at the same time, and they've all got different technological ideas. And the result is rarely pretty. There's a lot of violence, there's a lot of hatred, there's also a lot of friendship and curiosity and trade as well. But the outcome of this is a lot of technology and ideas change hands, and a lot of new ideas are created as a result. And ships benefit a great deal. And that goes not just for ships from Western Europe or Western Christendom, but also ships deployed by Islamic or even later on Mongol powers as well.
What comes to mind for me is how different Asian ships were from European ships. Thinking of the Chinese junks, these massive ships with squared off bows and a unique style of sails, they were really so much different than the European ships. How these technologies evolved, isolated from each other, but of course they would eventually meet and they could pick and choose different ideas from each other and learn from each other.
Yeah, no, it's fascinating. I mean, the one really big Chinese invention that reaches the Mediterranean in this era, which is revolutionary, is the compass. And that reaches the Mediterranean at the time of the Crusades. We don't know how. We have references to it being used and nothing to how it arrived. The sources don't tell us, but it arrived at this time. And for navigation, that's really important. And it also changes the way the crusading fleets operate. Because as navigation improves, as the ships get bigger, they start traveling direct from Italy to the Middle East rather than island hopping. And so it's a great deal faster, and the supply lines get a lot stronger as a result of that. But yeah, China has a major role to play in the sort of technological story of this era. But something I find quite interesting is you get, whether you're talking about military technology or maritime technology or architecture, you tend to get this rather sort of annoying debate where you get historians saying, our culture invented this first, we invented it, and then you took it. And all sorts of different communities and cultures and civilizations have a stake in that game, and they're all shouting at each other. Actually, the way I see it is very different, because entire ships are being sold in this era between civilizations. That's totally normal. Shipwrights could comfortably, we have examples, for example, of shipwrights traveling from Sicily to Egypt to construct ships for, in this case, I think it's the Ayyubid Sultan. You have ships from Egypt being resupplied and reconstructed in the ports of Crusader Cyprus. You have vessels moving from port to port the whole time. Crews often become very mixed from different cultures as people take on and lay off crew members. And so, not perhaps surprisingly, maritime technology changes hands really, really easily. Because we live in an era where we think of technology as being this sort of cutting-edge scientific thing, and the discoveries are hidden in the vaults of governments and corporations, protected by zombies and lasers and things like that. It's totally different in the Middle Ages. There's no labs, there's no research institutes creating ships. Mostly, the innovations take place with an artisan who thinks, let's do it this way. And so an innovation takes place. And then at the next harbour, someone goes, oh, I see what you did there. That's a good idea. And so the idea changes hands. There's a great deal more organic. And actually, this is part of the reason why the ships deployed by Byzantium, Western Europe, and the Muslim world are actually pretty similar. In some cases, they're the same because they've literally been sold from one civilization to another. So it creates a different sort of landscape for these things.
So we've talked about the role of the ships in the trade across the Mediterranean. What was the process at the ports? Today we think of container ships and giant cranes and roll-on and roll-off ships. Can you describe what these ports would have looked like during the Crusades?
So, and there's various considerations. The first is obviously the limitations of technology. We don't have all of that. The other consideration is if you are the head of a port authority, you can never be quite sure if the crew of an incoming ship is going to try and kill you, which again isn't typically a problem in the modern day. I hope in most cases anyway. So the first thing is some ships, particularly galleys, sort of earlier in this period, they don't require harbours at all. They just require a beach. You can literally pull them up on a beach, and so many of the early harbours or areas used as early harbours are not just that, just beaches where you pull the ship into shallow water, empty the goods from it, and then pull the whole thing up onto the beach as high as you can get it. Later on, as the ships get bigger, that's just not going to work. But the problem is there aren't many harbours that are able to carry a bulk carrier. So, for example, the biggest Crusader port is the port of Acre, and so the big ships would anchor off the port, and much of the major merchandise would be brought into the harbour via longships, lots of longboats. And the way it would work is, let's say you've just pulled up or you've just anchored outside the port of Acre, you would contact a pilot vessel, and the pilot vessel would then board your vessel to ascertain exactly who you are and where you're from. Provided they're satisfied, they would then go back to the port authority, report who you are, and then they would lower the chain. So across the entrance of most of the big medieval ports, you have an enormous chain, normally supported by a boom of tree trunks in order to keep it at sea level. and that's to prevent ships from breaking into a harbour and then staging an attack. So it's a barrier. And so once merchant vessels have been checked out, the chain can be lowered or removed, and then the longboats can begin to ferry the goods to and fro from the ship to the harbour. Once in the harbour, you've got various lockups where the goods will be stored, and they have to go straight into these lockups to begin with, because they then have to be assessed for taxation. And taxes in the Crusader states could take unusual forms. Normally, as you'd expect, it would be paid in money. But later on, incoming Crusader ships, believe it or not, had to pay a tax that was partially payable in crossbows, because crossbows was the present need. So if you want to be allowed into the harbour, you've got to present a stack of crossbows. But once the goods have been offloaded and they've been assessed, and then they've been taxed, and that tax has been taken first, from then it will be released into the warehouse, it will be released into the markets for sale to whoever may wish to buy it. But practically, that is the procedure for doing it.
As they're bringing these goods across the Mediterranean, the Aegean, the Adriatic, there would, of course, be somebody trying to capture them. Piracy has existed as long as vessels have been on the water. So what was the state of piracy during this time?
There's a lot of it, and all ships have to be provided with a large cache of weapons for precisely this reason. Some ships suffer multiple attacks by pirates. Some ships are taken over entirely, even warships at times. And it doesn't help by the fact that many of the better armed merchant vessels might very easily, should they see a viable target, decide that actually they're going to switch over to being a pirate just for the time being, because they can see a target they want to pick on. So a merchant vessel becomes a warship very easily. There's no military civilian division. If you think you can take another ship on, then it's very likely then your captain might say, well, we're going to do this. So piracy remains a problem, and most of the civilizations involved in the events of the Middle East in this time, that most of them are at it. One quite distinctive aspect of this is that when eventually in 1291, when the last of the mainland Crusader states collapsed, and the Knights Hospitaller and Knights Templar obviously had to abandon their castles in the Crusader states. Well, the Templars were dissolved soon afterwards, but the Knights Hospitaller, they created an island state for themselves on the Isle of Rhodes, and then later on, perhaps more famously, on the Isle of Malta. And on both those islands, they maintained large corsair fleets, which continued right the way up into the modern period. So Hospitaller galleys, Hospitaller warships were among the leaders in corsair activity for hundreds of years, from the early 14th century right the way into the beginnings of modernity, really.
Interesting. I didn't realize the Hospitallers had such a fleet of ships.
Yes, they're leading at one of Christendom's leading military maritime powers, and that they offer a great deal of resistance to the Ottoman Empire in the early modern period, as it begins its expansion into the Aegean and later on into the Eastern Mediterranean.
And being a podcast largely about shipwrecks, I must ask, what sorts of navigation dangers did these ships face?
So there are some lighthouses, albeit rudimentary, but there's virtually no buoyage, and so really you are dependent on pilots to get you into and out of harbours, particularly harbours where there are significant offshore shoals, and there are significant offshore shoals facing many of the big ports in the Eastern Mediterranean. North Africa is also particularly famous for its shoal waters. So experience is crucial. By the time we get to the 13th century, so the 1200s, you get the beginnings of the first maritime charts, which are good enough for navigation rather than being sort of impressionistic and not really suitable for that kind of thing. But even that, they're quite sort of broad. They don't detail specific maritime hazards as a maritime almanac might, for example. Nothing like that. There are some descriptions, written descriptions of some of the hazards facing people trying to get into various ports, both those written in the Muslim world and in Western Christendom as well. But they're not nearly as clearly marked out as they would be today. And then you've got the other sort of technological limitations, which is that some medieval ships needed sort of 10 or 12 anchors. You couldn't just drop one big metal one and just anchor your ship off the coast. And many of these anchors slip. They're not developed in quite the same way to dig into the seabed in quite the same way that modern day anchors would be. So anchoring's hazardous. Lee shores are hazardous because you can be so easily blown in from the shore and then shipwrecked. So it's enormously dangerous. And many of the clearest accounts we have of sea voyages are people saying just how much they don't like them because seasickness, piracy, no one's quite sure where they're going. It's a little bit hit and miss. You've got virtually no way of signaling where you are at night, so nighttime collisions can be a problem, although you do get some fleet commanders saying, right, everyone's got to have lanterns in the rigging at night because it's just ridiculous not to when you've got ships in close company, but some don't. Nighttime collisions do happen. And then, of course, you have the additional perils of monsters. Now, just because these didn't exist doesn't mean they weren't seen as a hazard. And so you have various books of advice that tell you how you should deal. For example, if you come under attack by a group of sirens. Now, obviously sirens don't exist, but they were taken seriously then, and the standing advice for medieval mariners who encounter an attack by sirens is to stuff the crew's ears with wax and then to shoot down the sirens with crossbows. So there you go. That's how you deal with sirens in the medieval period.
Are there any notable shipwrecks that have been found from this period?
Not as many as you might like. And unfortunately, not many of the really big ones. Most of the vessels that have been discovered are coastal vessels. And of course, there's the obvious factor there that the coastal vessel, because it will typically travel in shallow water, is more discoverable by marine archaeologists because it sits in so much more shallower seas. The bigger vessels haven't. So unfortunately, I'm not aware of any, certainly not intact, Crusader galley that has survived on the seabed in any kind of recognizable form, and not the big ships either. But the coastal vessels have, and those have generated some interest. There was a fair amount of interest recently in a sword that was discovered a little way off the coast, and it does seem likely to date from the 12th or 13th century, which presumably was being carried. Something else that has been found in a fair number of quantities is one of the big sort of commercial and economic realities of the Middle East is that Egypt is economically the most powerful region, but Egypt lacks two things. It lacks wood and it lacks iron. And much of Egypt's needs in this era are supplied via the forests and iron mines in southern Turkey, or Anatolia as it was known then. And those goods have to move down the coast to Egypt through the coastal waters of the Crusader states, who of course have an interest in that trade too. But these small coastal vessels, particularly given the convectional winds, it's not unusual for them to be wrecked on the rockier parts of the shoreline. And so those wrecks have survived quite a lot, particularly those carrying iron ingots, because those can still be discovered.
The Knights Templar, in particular, has been a popular topic over the last 30 years or so, and were key figures in the Crusades, as were the Knights Hospitaller. Who were these groups, and what roles did they play during the Crusades?
Sure. So the Knights Hospitaller and Knights Templar, they were committed to the defence, and in the Hospitaller's case, to the provision of medical care in the Crusader states. And to that end, they tried to gather as many supporters as possible. They both started really small. The Hospitallers began as a medical institution in Jerusalem. The Templars began as a small group of knights patrolling the roads between the ports and Jerusalem. But they both grew to become some of the largest international corporations or institutions of their era. And the way they did this is to send emissaries back to Western Europe to explain what it is that they did. So they explained their work in the Kingdom of Jerusalem or the Principality of Antioch, and then they tried to request donations. And so from a financial perspective, they operated a bit like a charity in some regards. They went out asking for donations, the donations then being for their cause, which was either the military defense of the Crusader states or the provision of medical care. And plenty of donors and benefactors came forward. And they typically made donations not in money, because that wasn't the main form of exchange in the medieval period. They did it in land. So they might give a group of fields or a couple of villages. And so over time, villages, towns, strongholds, harbour facilities, houses, churches, chapels were handed over to the Templars and Hospitallers, who began to establish a massive portfolio of estates across Western Christendom, which is why if you go to many parts of Germany or France or Italy or England or elsewhere, you'll find places with the word temple in the title. That's because often this was the centre of a Templar estate. And the reason the Templars and Hospitallers have these estates is because each estate was required to send 1/3 of its income to the Crusader states every year. This is what made the Templars and Hospitallers, or part of the reason why they became so wealthy, because 1/3 of hundreds, possibly even thousands of estates is a lot of money, a lot of resources, and of course these places act as recruitment centres too. And so they need ships that will get out all these resources and personnel, which have been gathered from across Western Christendom on an annual basis to the Crusader states. So they need really big ships. And that's why some of the biggest ships we have on record were those by the Templars and Hospitallers. They're there to work that network and to bring goods and people out to the Crusader states on an annual basis.
Earlier, we mentioned how the Crusade states didn't last very long. What was the cause of their ultimate downfall?
So there's a couple of several reasons. It's a little bit of a sort of backstory required here. So after the First Crusade, the Crusader states grew to become very powerful, and they became among the leading powers in the Middle East. And they became embroiled in a major contest for control over much of the region with, famously, Saladin, and his empire based out of much of Syria and Egypt. Saladin won that contest in 1187, and the Crusader states virtually collapsed in their aftermath. And for the next 50 years, crusade after crusade went out to the Eastern Mediterranean, trying to rebuild the Crusader states, trying to reconquer Jerusalem, which briefly they did. But they never got quite as large as they had in their first form. And they were always weaker after this than the surrounding Muslim powers ruled by Saladin's heirs. So for a time, there was this period of retrenchment, which was enabled to a large degree by the fact that Saladin's heirs spent most of their time fighting amongst themselves. And then the Mongols arrived, and they conquered the greater part of the Middle East, and Mongol armies were 3 or 4 times bigger than the biggest armies raised by, for example, Saladin or the Crusader states. They were enormous. And a huge war developed because the only power that proved capable of meeting the Mongols in the Middle East in battle was a new empire that began in 1250 called the Mamluk Empire, which is an Islamic empire founded originally by enslaved people who had been raised as warriors in Egypt, but who became so numerous and powerful they took power for themselves. So the Mamluk Empire, established in 1250, grew to become powerful enough to meet the Mongols in battle, and the Mamluks substantially expanded their military and expanded their armies so that they could confront the Mongols successfully, which they did. And within that titanic conflict between the Mamluks and the Mongols, 2 sets of massive armies, the Crusader states became, quite honestly, very much a sideshow. And when the Mamluks got a bit of free time, basically, from facing off against the Mongols, they just knocked over a few more Crusader castles or towns, and eventually they destroyed the Crusader states in their entirety. But the Crusader states' end is not a sort of titanic battle. It's simply the Mamluks not knocking over their major cities whilst they're really worried about their main enemy, who are the Mongols. It takes 30 years for the Crusader states to be reduced and then to collapse. It's a long, drawn-out process.
Well, Dr. Nicholas Morton, I can't tell you how much I appreciate you joining me today. One more time, please tell everyone how they can find your books.
Okay, so yeah, just type in my name, Nicholas Morton, into Amazon. You'll find all sorts of books. I've written a military history of the Crusader states, which is published by Oxford University Press. I've written the Mongol Storm, which is a history of the Mongol invasions into the Middle East in the 13th century. I've written a book called The Field of Blood, which is about a really important Crusader battle. You can find me on Twitter and you can find me on Threads. And also, if you're interested, I do have a fairly small, but I have plans to expand it, a channel on YouTube, which actually has a handle of @MedievalNearEast. So feel free to have a look at that one too.
Your knowledge of the Crusades and Middle East history is vast, and I, for one, have learned quite a bit from you today. So thank you again. I really appreciate it. It's been great talking with you.
It's my pleasure. Thank you.
That's going to do it for the Ships of the Crusades. Thanks again to Dr. Nicholas Morton for joining me. You can find his latest book, The Mongol Storm, on Amazon.com or at basicbooks.com. Shipwrecks and Sea Dogs is written, edited, and produced by me, Rich Napolitano. You can help support the show by making a donation at buymeacoffee.com/shipwreckspod, or by subscribing to Into History, a collection of some of the best history podcasts available. Get ad-free access, bonus content, and more at intohistory.com/shipwreckspod. Original theme music is by Sean Siegfried, and you can follow him at seansiegfried.com or on YouTube at Sean Secret. Please join me again in 2 weeks for a new episode, but until then, don't forget to wear your life jackets.